Good evening, everyone. My name is Tina Campt, and I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. It is my great pleasure in that position to be able to welcome you to what is truly amazing, which is that this is our 43rd Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference. 43 years, and this year's conference promises to be as exciting, as penetrating as all of our previous ones. As you know, the topic of our conference is Subverting Surveillance, Strategies to End State Violence. And for those of you who have been here earlier, who got here earlier this afternoon to participate in the first session, you were participating in a series of workshops that I hope you recognize have really begun the important work that we're really aspiring to do at this year's conference. We're really proud to have been able to bring together a broad group of community thinkers and organizers to strategize about the ways of confronting the deepening penetration of surveillance practices in our daily lives, and to engage and to think about how to engage in self-defense against the state's insistent demands for constant access in the name of security and public order. The sessions scheduled for today and tomorrow focus on technologies of surveillance and self-defense, the normalization of the insecurity state, and medical legal surveillance, which are intended, and these sessions, all of them are intended, to get us to begin the work of strategizing. Our hope is that they will educate, mobilize, and better equip us to engage these proliferating systems in ways that are generative and transformative. I'm going to be doing a series of longer thank yous tomorrow. But for right now, there's two people that I have to thank and recognize, and those are the two people who have done all of the heavy lifting for this conference. One of whom is not able to be here due to a personal crisis that she's having, a family crisis. Her name is Beck Jordan Young. Many of you know her. She is really saddened to not be able to be with us. Although our hearts are with her, please know that she is with us here in spirit. The other person who was stalwart as the co-organizer of the conference is the person standing right there, who is Avi Cummings, our program and media manager. Please join me in recognizing Avi. So I'd like to go straight into this session because the panel that we have lined up for you are amazing, and I know you are here to see them and not listen to me right now. So I'm going to introduce the moderator for the panel, Craig Willse. Craig Willse is the author of The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States, and he's co-editor with Patricia Clough of Beyond Biopolitics, Essays on the Governance of Life and Death. Willse also works in queer LGBT studies in an ongoing collaboration with one of our panelists, legal scholar Dean Spade. Willse's scholarship is informed by his political work outside of the academy, which has included community organizing around housing access, social movements for trans justice, and prison abolition, and queer anarchist anti-war activism. As an associate professor at George Mason University, Craig serves as faculty advisor to GMU's Students Against Israeli Apartheid. Please join me in welcoming an amazing activist and academician. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you to everybody at BCRW who helped make today possible. So just a quick word before I introduce our panelists. The format for tonight will be we'll hear some brief opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then I'll ask a couple questions to get the conversation started, and then we'll open it up to conversation from the audience. So that is our plan for today. So I'll introduce everybody, and then we'll hear from each of them one by one. So our first speaker will be Rabab Abdulhadi, who is Director and Senior Scholar in Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies, and Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies, Race and Resistance Studies, and affiliated faculty in Sexuality Studies at San Francisco State University. Previously, she served as the first director of the Center for Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. She is co-founding editorial board member of Islamophobia Studies Journal, co-author of Mobilizing Democracy, Changing U.S. Policy in the Middle East, and co-editor of Arab and Arab American Feminisms, Gender, Violence, and Belonging, American Quarterly Forum on Palestine and American Studies from 2015, and a special issue of MIT Electronic Journal of Middle East Studies. We'll then hear from Dylan Rodríguez, who is professor at the University of California, Riverside, and was elected chair of the Academic Senate by his faculty peers in 2016. After spending the first 16 years of his career in the Department of Ethnic Studies and serving as its chair from 2009 to 16, he joined the faculty of the Department of Media and Cultural Studies in 2017. Professor Rodríguez is the author of 2 books, Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals and the U.S. Prison Regime, and Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition. We'll then hear from Nandita Sharma, who is Associate Professor of Racism, Migration, and Transnationalism in the Department of Sociology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Home Rule, The Partition Between Natives and Migrants in the Post-Colonial New World Order, which is coming from Duke University Press. And she's also a co-editor with Bridget Anderson and Cynthia Wright of a special issue of the journal Refuge on No Borders, a practical response to state controls on people's migration. And then finally, we'll hear from Dean Spade, Associate Professor at the Seattle University School of Law. In 2002, he founded the Sylvia Vera Law Project, a nonprofit collective that provides free legal help to low-income people and people of color who are trans, intersex, and or gender nonconforming. He is the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists.
Good evening. I begin by honoring the indigenous people on whose stolen lands we meet. The laptop. I want to thank Rebecca Young, Tina Kam, Avi Cummings, Pam, and Sona for making this possible for me. So I don't do PowerPoint, but people asked, do you have PowerPoint? So I did a PowerPoint. So I'm gonna try to go through it. So basically, I want to do my intervention in a couple of parts. The first part, we're going to give introductory remarks. And the second part, I want to take on examples from our own experience at San Francisco State. So I wanted to just mention some general remarks about the whole question of what does security mean, and for whom, when we say about security, specifically in the case of Palestine, how it is constructed about Israeli security and Palestinians wanting land, and so on. I'm not going to go too much into it. The question of when we talk about progressive, who is progressive and what does progress mean, and the whole question of forward, backward, the question of civility, the question of who is barbaric, and so on. Okay, and I wanted to take something from the context that we're in. One, I think many of you have already been reading the papers about what's happening with the scandals that Netanyahu, is facing at least three different corruption scandals. But it's very interesting the way in which the liberal New York Times, the progressive, supposedly, New York Times, is constructing the problem as it's okay, any of these scandals are fine because Netanyahu is good for the security of Israel. So again, this is part of, just to keep that to remind us. But one of the things that has been very much in the news recently is the construction of Ahed Tamimi, the young Palestinian teenager. And I'm not trying to make a shortcut, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm choosing something that is on everybody's mind so we know what we're talking about. We don't need to do too much introduction. Ahed has been constructed as a fake Palestinian. Her family has been constructed as a fake family by none other than the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Michael Oren. He refers to the fact that she has blonde hair and blue-eyed, which is very interesting because it also makes a note about the whole question of how do we think about race and skin color in the context of the Arab and Muslim communities, which was not an issue in the history until the encounter of colonialism, and it becomes then race and skin color equal to each other. And if we need to kind of some reminders, we would remind ourselves of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who was one of the people who fought against the Crusaders, and he was called a Mamluk. Mamluk is somebody who is owned, and he came from Caucasus. The Bosnians are also Muslims, and so on, just to kind of remind us of all of these issues that I think are really important to think about. But with Ahed also, her family is constructed as having motherhood and parenthood deficiency. And this is very interesting in the sense that Palestinian parents are constructed as cowards, Palestinian adults, not just parents, as constructed as cowards, as they're not taking care of their children. They put them in the front to fight their own battles because they are unable to fight their own battles. And they have, it's very interesting, parenthood deficiency, in a sense that parenthood becomes naturalized, not constructed. So just to think about that in terms of gender and sexuality studies. And then when it becomes naturalized, then it's constructed as deficient. And Palestinian mothers and parents could do things that other people, especially Israeli parents, do not do. And it becomes very interesting in the ways in which, for example, when Muhammad Abu Khdeir was killed, kidnapped, made to drink kerosene and burned alive, the first thing that came out of the Israeli, and this is from 1972 magazine, the first thing that came out from the Israeli police that he was gay and he was killed because his family wanted to cleanse their family honor. This is one of the things that keep coming up again and again. And of course, we know that Muhammad al-Durra, his father, couldn't. These construction, I'm really rushing. These are the construction of Palestinian womanhood in particular, or queerness, and I can talk about that a little bit later on, is, and especially when we talk about Ahed Tamimi now, is constructed as playing on all the tropes of terrorism. So the war on terrorism that is not only begin since 9/11, 2001. When am I supposed to stop? I'm looking, 3 minutes? Okay. When the war on terrorism that gets constructed, then here Palestinians fit into it, both in the Israeli and the US discourse. And this goes from the whole question of Algerian women, the way they are represented, and I would say that's actually quite the whole Fanonian discussion, and I'm very, very happy to discuss it and so on, in the sense that Algerians get constructed as the Algerians, as the male Algerians, and the women get constructed as their women, and it's very similar to this in the Palestinian context. But also, when we show these films, and I want to just give examples from my class, when I show this in my classes, the students inevitably, when they see the Battle of Algiers, inevitably think about why Algerians have placed the bombs and killed all these French people. And nobody thinks about the French intelligence who leave a party at which the French women are sitting there entertaining with their domestic workers who are Algerians and go to place a bomb inside the Algerian Qasbah and blow up a whole neighborhood. Nobody thinks about that because we are programmed in our mind to think of security as the status quo security, the security of the state, and not the security of the people who are marginalized by the state. And so this is also, again, the way in which Ahed Tamimi is constructed by the Israelis. In a sense, this is how it fits within the whole question of progressiveness, and this is also how white supremacy also fits in the settler colonial project, and that is not separated from it. In a sense, then, I don't think we can treat US or Israeli settler colonial state as an exception, because it is inherently and by definition racist, genocidal, exploitative, and expansive. And here this goes back to the history, and when we talk about the history of Palestinians, Shoot the Women First, this is a book that talks about quote-unquote terrorist women, and I can discuss it. COINTELPRO, and then it also is used to justify. So for example, the justification for lack of electricity in Gaza today, or lack of food in Gaza today, is presented by the Israeli government as a need for their security. Actually, again, the New York Times presented last week, an article in which they said that Gaza, Hamas has waged 3 wars on Israel in the last 3 wars. And we know that actually it was Israel who was the one who was violated the ceasefire and so on. So what does this mean? I mean, I'm just reminding you, for those people who know it, that Gaza was presented 2014 as a naked woman, from the bottom down, Muslim naked woman. This is where the Israeli settlement said to Netanyahu, beat them and enter their mothers, but it actually also means sexually. violate. An Israeli professor said rape their mothers and sisters at Bar Ilan University. Israeli army, upon graduation, published these T-shirts. There is many of them on that says 1 shot, 2 kills, killing a Palestinian with the mother and the child inside, and the Israeli soldiers posing with Palestinian prisoners. Okay, let me just go back here. So what does this? So I just want to end with the words of the words that were used to introduce our panel by June Jordan. June Jordan's words talk about 600,000 Palestinians in Beirut, and she talked about the Sabra and Shatila massacre. But just like today, at that time, U.S. made security guarantees to the Palestinian fighters to protect the Palestinian civilians once the fighters left. Israel was supposed to be protecting, but Israel actually not only aided in floodlights on the Sabra and Shatila massacre, but also actually collaborated in the killing, according to the people I've interviewed from. Today, as the pressure mounts on Gaza to surrender, and there is no electricity, there is no medicine, there is no food, United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees already strapped, and now it's further strapped by the US cutting off porn. And Palestinian leadership is being threatened with cut off to its security agency funds. Palestinians are told again, as in 1982, and as Ahad Tamimi is saying, don't you dare stand up for yourself. Don't you dare speak up for yourself. And this is the whole message about Ahad Tamimi, because she is constructed as somebody who is defiant, who does not fit in the image of docility, but also does not fit in the image of the colonial feminism. Then and now, Israel presents itself as the progressive state that is only imprisoning her because they want to rein in a teenager who is not well behaved. They want to be able to take care of the job that Palestinian parents are unable to take care of, because that's what the parents are supposed to take care of, the adults. And this is where she is presented as irrational, as unreasonable, as somebody who does not deserve, as a fake, okay, somebody who does not deserve to be treated the same way that people in civilized nations do. So what is this, the proposal? What's the solution? Lock her up. And this speaks to the whole question of what does military security and incarceration mean. And I will stop at that.
Good evening, everybody. I want to say it's an honor and a little intimidating to, I realize, I think this is the first time I've spoken in a forum like this in a city where it's considered to be such a center of gravity for Black liberation struggle, for Puerto Rican independence struggle, for different forms of liberation struggle. So I'm scared, but I'm also really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I got to tell you, I'm really thrilled to be here. I appreciate being part of this group. So I have 8 minutes with you. I promised my facilitator I'd keep it to 8. Mass incarceration, police brutality, school-to-prison pipeline, and other terms of crisis have permeated the political theater of post-racialism and its apparent white nationalist aftermath. These keywords of an early 21st century liberal to progressive critique of racist state violence form an increasingly shared vernacular for academic scholarship, policy reform, nonprofit campaigns, foundation grants, and ongoing dialogue and debate across various communities and publics. But there is something troublesome in the ongoing industrialized circulation of these keywords, a territorialization and a corruption, at times a statecraft, of crisis terms that undermines the collective genius of their periodic radical rearticulation. As the particular phrase mass incarceration spreads across venues and publics, a relatively coherent narrative attains increasing political ideological traction. I wanted to start my time with you all tonight by outlining the progression of the increasingly hegemonic liberal mass incarceration narrative. First, there is an uneven though growing acknowledgement that over the last few decades there has been a systemic expansion of the institutional and cultural capacity and will to criminalize, profile, incarcerate, and denigrate targeted bodies, places, and populations. We might see this as a spreading, though sometimes hesitant and certainly overdue, acknowledgement of the facts of gendered racist state terror. Next in this narrative, quickly and slowly, alarmed responses spill across journalistic, testimonial, activist, and social scientific revelations, confirming the suspicion that the contemporary carceral domestic war may have misidentified or exceeded its operational objectives. We should be clear that this is a counter-abolitionist rejoinder. It is not incarceration that is the problem, it is the excess of mass incarceration that requires reform. Next, the mass incarceration narrative opens into spreading, dense accounts of the degradation and suffering that traverse stories of individualized tragedy to collectively, communally voiced insurgent outrage. These accounts are mobilized and repurposed by various narrators as the ethnographic, deeply personalized, and urgent reasons for reforming mass incarceration, as the primary evidence of the state's alleged criminological dysfunction. Of course, for many of us in this room, what complicates this part of the narrative is that so many of these accounts not only preceded the recent acknowledgement of the so-called mass incarceration crisis, but also seem to suggest that what has happened during the time in question is not the result of a dysfunctional state, but rather of an entirely functional one. And now, a protracted skirmish ensues as organized political blocs, cultural institutions, and emergent grassroots to social media collectives struggle to make sense, that is, to definitively narrate this turmoil. Yeah, that is a Hillary Clinton tweet, that's real. I didn't Photoshop that. It's still there. Y'all Google that, that's still there. Entering the skirmish at the same time that they are formed by it are multiple coalescences of organic and professional intellectuals of the racial state, of nonprofit and foundation regimes, of a liberal cultural industry, including think tank and foundation commissioned academics, writers, and artists. These are the well-placed, perhaps we, are the well-placed ones who collectively strive to restore a paradigmatic liberal faith in the virtues and possibilities of righteous national reform against this state-sanctioned climate of atrocity. From here grows a definitive, outraged rhetoric of liberal humanist alarm that strives for a sense of shared moral grievance. In 2012, a writer for The New Yorker asserts that, quote, "the scale and brutality of our prisons are the moral scandal of American life." While in 2014, the Soros Foundation announces a $50 million grant to the ACLU, to which is appended the proclamation that, quote, "America's bloated prisons are an appalling and expensive failure, overwhelming common sense and human decency," end quote. Morality, common sense, decency, these are the rhetorical signals of a violently hopeful thinking, one that requires a full, radical abolitionist rebuttal all the time, everywhere. The thinking that must be refuted goes something like this: that if there is such a massive problem as mass incarceration, it can be fixed. If we bring rational heart to mind in another adventure of humanist reform, if we follow the stories into the tragedy and insist over and over again that such harrowing details are not the primary or intended outcome of this state and its policy, its marshaling of cultural and domestic force, then solutions can be found in vigorous reform. The threads of post-American apartheid racial modernity can again be pulled taut around the jagged, always disarticulating edges of the civil underside where statecraft unfolds on the intimate geography of the flesh, et cetera, to be continued. In fact, the reform of mass incarceration, as it's been absorbed by the cultural ensemble of the state and its distensions, endorses an expansion of policing logics, including carceral policing logics, beyond the discrete institutional sites of prisons, jails, detention centers, juvenile facilities, et cetera. In the longer version of my comments, I think about how the Holder-Obama-Clinton ensemble's reformist autocritique of mass incarceration proliferates an invigorated and refurbished technology of policing, which is to say that the mass incarceration narrative is in most ways entirely symbiotic with an expansion of police force and of its various capacities to occupy the life worlds and ecologies of criminalized people and communities. The longer version, I actually talk about this report that comes out of the Eric Holder keynote that was published by the Brennan Center that is addressing federal prosecutors. Sorry if I just came after some Brennan Center folks here. I'm not really sorry, but I'm saying that. In this sense, any shared radical abolitionist praxis in this moment must pay close analytical and practical attention to the moments in which those who allegedly embrace the objective of ending or reducing mass incarceration may also advocate the absolute necessity of police, criminal jurisprudence, and incarceration as permanent conditions of sociality, collective safety, and even democracy. Let me end with a question about the implications of mass incarceration as a vernacular of militant state reform. It seems to be an almost canonized liberal common sense assumption within this narrative that the well-noted asymmetries of terror, catalyzed by so-called mass incarceration, are an unintended consequence of state policy and the contemporary racial cultural formation of the United States. I conclude by asking, what if this assumption is false? Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's a really great pleasure of mine to be part of this amazing panel and this amazing conference. And thank you for the organizers, Beck, Avi, Tina, and all of the staff who have been so helpful and amazing in getting me here all the way from Honolulu. So I'm going to be talking about the problematics of anti-trafficking campaigns. And since 1999, when I started working, in the summer of 1999, there were 4 boats that arrived on the west coast of British Columbia close by to Vancouver, Canada, where I was living at that time, that held about 599 people, well, exactly 599 people. And it was in the summer of 1999 that I started first coming across this discourse and soon enough state practice of anti-trafficking. And I've been concerned about it ever since, particularly how anti-trafficking legislation and the discourses that advance it has reframed state practices of deportation and state practices of border controls, and given them the cover of legitimacy. I'm especially concerned with how they have demonized those people who help other people move across national borders, and how they've worked to criminalize and ultimately prevent the emergence of modern-day Harriet Tubmans who will move people even despite state heavy sanctions against them. So, the 3 things that I'm particularly concerned about the way that anti-trafficking legislation works to change our minds about these state practices of deportation and migration controls, I'm just going to try and go through those very quickly. So, anti-deportation campaigns, we all, I'm sure in this room, know that they've been a central part of the immigrant justice movement here and around the world. And we would most certainly oppose the state when we see deportations depicted of this kind. But we might not necessarily oppose them when we see it depicted like this, when the person about to be deported is classified as a quote-unquote modern-day slave. Instead, we might actually see her, and it usually is a her in the anti-trafficking discourse, as being rescued, and her deportation as some kind of homecoming. So we're told that anti-trafficking legislation protects, quote-unquote, victims of trafficking. And it is true that since 2002 here in the United States, people identified as victims are eligible for special T visas, which offer them a temporary stay for a maximum of 3 years. But in the 14 years from 2002 to 2015, about 5,000 T visas were issued. And that is, of course, not nothing. That's 5,000 people with temporary visas that allow them to stay in the United States. But the greater problem with the T visa program is that such laws establish a normative narrative of victimhood. Women who don't perform the role of trafficked victim, for instance, not condemning sex work, or whose performance as victim is not believed by the state, cannot legalize their status, and they're often the ones who are deported. Even more importantly, they are seen to be legitimately deported. Within this anti-trafficking frame, then, the good girl, bad girl dichotomy that we see used very much against sex workers goes on to organize the good migrant, bad migrant trope. The second thing is criminalization. Usually, progressives and leftists oppose further criminalization, and especially ideologically driven law and order campaigns such as the war on drugs. But the focus on the violent nature of trafficking or smuggling enables anti-trafficking campaigns to be put forward on an agenda that calls for measures to combat it through heightened state intervention at the border and more jail time and higher fines for those who are charged as traffickers or smugglers, while allowing all of that to be seen as progressive. Yet, regardless of the rhetoric of anti-trafficking policies, that they protect migrants, the emphasis of anti-trafficking is on controlling unlawful migration. Indeed, the main result of anti-trafficking measures is to make migrations that the state has illegalized much more dangerous. As people smugglers or quote-unquote traffickers face greater penalties if they are caught, migrants are increasingly funneled through more precarious routes, leading to an unprecedented number of deaths, whether that's in the Mediterranean or the Aegean or at the US-Mexico border and many other borders across the world. The increased penalties that are attached to clandestinely moving people has also led to an increase in the cost of moving them. And that's placed migrants in greater debt and has created increased financial hardships on the families and communities that support their migration. Moreover, increased punitive measures against smuggling/trafficking have made the emergence of, as I said earlier, modern-day Harriet Tubmans even more unlikely. Anti-trafficking rhetoric hides the fact that it is next to impossible to cross a national border without a great deal of help from others. In January, an organization called No More Deaths that works at the US-Mexico border exposed the US Border Patrol and held a news conference accusing border agents of tampering with their water aid stations in the Arizona desert. Here's a picture of a border police officer emptying the water vessels that are left for migrants trying to cross that incredibly dangerous route. In January, Scott Warren, who is a volunteer with No More Deaths, was arrested, again in the name of protecting migrants because he was smuggling/trafficking them. Now, we know that the immigrant justice movement is one of the largest and most important social movements of our time. This is a picture from the Los Angeles 2006 demonstrations. And it is precisely for this reason, the power of our movement, that states across the world are looking for ways to undermine us. So I argue that anti-trafficking campaigns need to be seen in this light of states trying to delegitimize our social movements by mystifying the role of nation states in thwarting human mobility. Anti-trafficking campaigns work to conceal precisely those situations where we should be insisting to know why there is a lack of safe migration routes on this planet, and why people need to move away from a number of politically, economically, and/or socially violent or untenable situations. Instead, the anti-trafficking framework urges us to blame the traffickers and let the state off the hook. In 2015, in the midst of the crisis facing millions upon millions of refugees, British Lord Ashdown called for the bombing of boats taking migrants from Libya across the Mediterranean into Europe. This, he argued, was the way to prevent them from being trafficked. The narratives of victimization and criminality within the ideological framework of trafficking organizes a contemporary moral panic that lets a system of global apartheid to be seen as wholly unproblematic and wholly unpolitical. It is for these reasons that the anti-trafficking campaigns articulate so well with anti-migrant agendas, and why I've argued that anti-trafficking is the moral reform arm of the contemporary anti-immigrant politics and of state policies of ever-heightened and militarized border controls. Thanks.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so eternally grateful for the Barnard Center for Research on Women that always puts on like the most relevant conversations that I want to be at, and that is just always producing work that really blends really relevant social movement work with things that people are doing in universities in ways that I think are kind of like really unusual and dangerous and not allowed in academia. So thank you so much for putting this together and for including me with this incredible group of people. When I was thinking about this theme of this conversation about selling the security state, of course I thought about the recent headlines about how Caitlyn Jenner is being honored as a champion of Israel and LGBT rights by the World Values Network at their Champion of Jewish Values International Awards Gala. I'm going to be accurate about this. Right, and so this is so parallel to other things we've seen a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year. Our gay mayor in Seattle was honored by Stand With Us, one of the kind of most right-wing, virulent Israel advocacy hate groups, for his Israel advocacy. So I want to think a little bit about some of this, what we call pinkwashing. And I'm also thinking about it on the heels of the recent Creating Change conference. For those of you who are in the world of gay advocacy, you will know that Creating Change is like the largest gay for pay kind of conference in the country, where like both like people who work at gay nonprofits and like actual grassroots activists as well gather. It's an interesting terrain of struggle in which there's been for 30 years a lot of different fights about marginalization and exclusion at that space. In 2016, the conference was really controversial, in particular because they included a panel put together by and proposed by ICE. And in the same conference, 2016, there was also a reception hosted and put together by this group, A Wider Bridge, which is it's just a pinkwashing group. It seeks in its mission to like connect LGBT people with Israel. And so both of these were sites of protest. And at first they canceled both of them, and then they reinstated the A Wider Bridge event. So one of the things I'm interested in is what was different to sort of the gay mainstream, NGLTF, which sees itself as the more progressive. It also is called the task force, the more progressive of the sort of national gay organizations. It pitches itself that way. What's different for them about why did they cancel the panel hosted by ICE and not and reinstate the A Wider Bridge reception? And so this is, Creating Change is an ongoing side of struggle. There's this year again, that year there was a really big protest in 2016 by a lot of people opposing Zionism, and then of course like the Zionist machine went after people who were visible in the pictures from that protest, and there was a lot of intense backlash against individuals and against groups that were doing organizing, especially often targeting people of color. And this year that we were back at that battle. Anybody who wants to sign our petition really should. It's at cancelpinkwashing.com or .org, cancelpinkwashing.org. We really need your signature. We continue to struggle with Creating Change because they have then just kind of basically after that battle in 2016, basically the Zionists won. Like now, people who put on any related programming, it has to be like Zionist leaders who put it on. It has to be, you can't mention Palestine. Like they basically have won that terrain for a moment. And it's interesting for us as, leftist, abolitionist, anti-Zionist, like, is this an important space to organize? Is a really interesting question, because we can see how right now the Israel advocacy groups are really, really focused on grabbing these LGBT spaces. So even though the task force, NGLTF, will always be basically like a rights-seeking group that's part of a broader settler colonial U.S. project of inclusion, and we can have concerns about the limits of that. It's also like a key funnel of like where queer and trans activists like show up to get trained and what it means to be part of our movement. And this organization is right now taking a strong stand. Like some of their statements in response to this is like, we don't have a position on Israel and Palestine. We're an organization without an international mission. So also this incredible retreat from international solidarity in queer and trans politics compared to if we looked at the 70s or 80s or even 90s, and certainly compared to where the left of queer and trans activism is. That's really significant. So it's like hard because it's this like limited space of this gay nonprofit organizing, but at the same time, it feels like a space we have to fight for, similar to campuses, right? Because A Wider Bridge also launched their Campus Fellows program this year. So they're doing kind of a Hillel move of literally paying staffers to be on campus to rebrand all queer and trans activism on campus through a pro-Zionist framework, right? And they started that work this year. So these become interesting fights. What's interesting to me about NGLTF being able to see what's wrong with the ICE panel but not see what's wrong with A Wider Bridge, I mean, certainly different kinds of pressure are happening there, but part of it is just like this basic thing that we really need an abolitionist analysis for, which is like, it doesn't have to be the literal government to be part of the apparatuses of violence, right? Like it's such an easy move. You just put a nonprofit in front of it and they're like, oh no, it's just dialogue. It's like, we're all gonna connect and open our hearts to each other like that. So I think a lot about what abolitionist moves we need in this work against pinkwashing, and how overlapping the kinds of discernment we're seeking and practicing are, and that is one piece of that as this work ramps up. Also this move of sort of saying like, we don't have an international mission, it's a separate issue, Palestine is a separate issue, we're just trying to have a gay conference here, like that, this is, an abolitionist analysis helps us always see the ways in which if you live in a prison state or prison nation, every single institution, every single space is constituted by the prison, right, constituted by the border. So it's helpful for us to, I think, use those kinds of analysis. And that kind of discernment about the nature of apparatuses of state violence is part of what I've been really trying to think about, how to do this blend around abolition. Something that's our last point I want to make about that kind of thing, I think connects to some of the other things people have said. I've been really moved for the last year. I read that really incredible book, Policing the Planet, that I think we should all read. It's a really relevant anthology. And there's a piece in there by Ruthie and Craig Gilmore that I'm not just going to say this exactly, but one of the things I got out of their piece that I just kind of can't let go of is this notion that whenever our movements or anything succeeds in throwing something like policing into crisis, there's the possibility that we'll get some dismantling, but there's also a really big possibility that we'll just see policing or the prison or whatever it is, the border expand, have new jobs in our society, and be more legitimate after the crisis, right? I see that happening all around us. I really saw that and always see it from what Dylan was sharing as well. And I see that this relates to Rabab's idea about what is progressive. I've been thinking a lot about how do various institutions pretend to be progressive in order to do their work. And you especially see this, I think, with pinkwashing, but you see it on a lot of issues. I live in King County in Seattle, and the King County Prosecutor's Office is like an expert at this. They are the most progressive prosecutors in the country, and they exist just to protect women and queer people, and just to fight for racial justice and Islamophobia. And they are really doing like a very quick work to adopt any kind of strategies that emerge from abolitionist organizing and activism to get rid of the state and make it into their work that expands their office. So literally now there's a King County prosecutor whose job it is to do restorative justice circles with youth. So he moved over there and they hired someone to replace him. Like there's so much of that going on where this is a longer term problem. There's some really great work that looks at states that have more intensively incorporated restorative justice into their statewide criminal punishment systems and how the same people get arrested, and there's more alternatives to incarceration, and then people go through those systems, and so that ultimately the work of the system is the same, and there's just more staffing of it, and it's more expansive, and it holds people and touches people in lots of different, still brutally violent ways. So I've been thinking about that, and also I live in Seattle, as I mentioned, where Charlene Lyles was killed last year, and she is like many people, someone who the cops were called because she was having mental health stuff, and then the cops came and killed her. And so now we have a statewide bill to increase training for police about mental health. It's just like every single form of resistance results, and I can't tell you how bought in a lot of people I really love and collaborate with are into this bill. And so I'm just really struggling with the ways in which what I think Ruthie and Craig Gilmore were talking about, how this expansion of duties and further legitimacy occurs, and how we had a different kind of problem under the Obama administration with co-optation, and now we have this problem where Trump sets the bar for what is progressive so incredibly low, because you just have to be like, I'm not Trump, then all of these, especially in a place like Seattle, but I think in many of our, many places, all these people can be progressive while making the most like token moves towards our critiques and concerns that our movements are bringing up, and then we don't see the material results of like actually dismantling these systems that we're seeking. So, I mean, that's just like, that's the sort of picture I see when I think about this question that this panel asks us about, which is like, how is the security state selling itself? And there are so many obstacles to us having more effective, wide-scale resistance to that, because I think part of the dilemma is that the propaganda is still pretty much believed. Like we're still like, oh, they hired a person who looks the right way to run the thing, or oh, they said they want to dialogue with us, or like I live in a city where there's a community police commission that is like designed to do nothing but just be an interface between the cops' ongoing killing and the communities affected by it. So I think there's a lot of questions there that relate to everyone's work, also about sort of the nonprofit industrial complex and the ways we get organized to proclaim victories that are not there, and how those false victories operate and how we're incentivized to proclaim victories because there's a restorative justice circle in the King County Prosecutor's Office or whatever. But yeah, I'm interested to talk to all of you about some of those dilemmas facing us right now.
Thank you so much for all those remarks. I think we've so much to talk about. I have some questions I want to ask, but actually I thought maybe first I wanted to see if anybody on the panel wanted to respond to anything that you'd heard. If you were, I saw a lot of taking notes and nodding of head. So if anybody first wanted to directly respond to anything that was said, and then I can ask a question or two.
I was going to comment on what you were saying, Dean. The whole question in which the people who are presenting themselves as quote-unquote progressive, and I was reminded of the U.S. Social Forum. I don't know if you were involved, but at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit in 2010, there was a workshop that was proposed by the Stand With Us. It was a workshop that was organized by Stand With Us, and it was supposed to cover queer movements. They didn't call it queer, they said LGBTQ, LGBT, not LGBTQI. Movements in the Middle East. And the planning committee of the US Social Forum jumped on it, immediately approved it. We found out that it was organized by Stand With Us. At that time, not everybody knew what Stand With Us was, and we knew it was a Zionist organization, it was a front, it was engaged in pinkwashing. But it wasn't really about Stand With Us. The issue was not really about Stand With Us. The issue was about the resistance of people to see that this is a way in which to present a front, to get into it and further invite more colonialism, Orientalism, racism, Zionism, and undermine the very presence at that point, because this was the US Social Forum in 2010, which was very different than the earlier one in Atlanta. This was more similar to the World Social Forum in the sense that we're international organizations. There was a lot of organizing from the Palestinian community organizers and so on. It was in Detroit with many of our allies who were involved and so on. So there was a lot of resistance to it, and people at the National Planning Committee had a very strong adversity to canceling the workshop. We were told that the workshop would present security issues, very interesting, and that if it was going to be canceled, the Palestinian community had to provide security. We stepped up, actually, and we said, okay, we will do it. But we said, why is it that if a workshop gets canceled, all hell is going to break loose? Two is that there was also the same thing that you were saying, in the sense that we were told that the communities in Detroit, the grassroots organizations, local grassroots organizations in Detroit, especially for socioeconomic Black organizations in Detroit in particular, did not really think that this is an international issue. It was too complicated. I mean, think about the racism. Yeah. Too complicated. They couldn't deal with it. And therefore, if we impose this on them, this is going to make more hardship because they're not going to be getting funding as a result, and they are not going to be able to do their work, and they couldn't care less. It's very interesting. We forced the issue, and we went to the National Planning Committee, and we forced the vote. And it was actually the people who were the vanguard of taking the fight were the Detroit groups. They were the ones who said, we need to discuss this. We're not going to allow a workshop on injustice to take place in that. But the burden that it placed upon the people who are supposed to be marginalized in itself, again, you're supposed to be an native informant, because now we're talking about the progressive community. We're supposed to be providing that information to, and we had to follow up the whole US Social Forum and continue doing it. And people in the National Planning Committee also raised up the question of funding. So this in itself brings up, and I think for me, it's also the question is that what do people know? People know a lot of this stuff. So where do we begin to challenge the things that are taken for granted? So I missed the point when I was talking about Ahed, because I hate PowerPoints, and my computer is broken. It's been for 9 days. But I was thinking about the ways in which we also jump to construct Ahed Tamimi as a way to defend her within the status quo discourses, rather than get out of them and say, we are actually not going to engage. We're not going to engage on the debate on your terms. The terms that are presented to us are problematic terms. So we want to get out of those terms and say, the colonized, the marginalized, the oppressed don't really care what the oppressors think about them. and don't have to tailor-made their discourse and make it possible. And I think this is, to me, this is what struck me about what my colleagues were saying here.
So I want to thank you all for what you offered. It seemed to me that part of a shared concern we have is around trying to figure out what it is that makes such seemingly thin and naive, reactionary, progressive propaganda actually believable. Right? I mean, I'm looking at these images that the two of you put up, and I'm listening to you talk, Dean, and it just seems so transparently bullshit, right? And so it's kind of mind-numbing to be wondering how it is that people, as you put it, Dean, people that we respect and love, buy that stuff, like buy into it, and it just tells me that I think we got to do better work telling some better stories, right? I think in addition to demystifying things, that maybe we need to be telling some better stories, because I think that these stories are being bought into way too easily. It speaks to me to the work that we have to do. We have to do.
I think it's hard too because, like, when it's Stand With Us, you know, so Stand With Us is just so egregious a group. They're pretty illegitimate, and it's more it's easier to show people, like, now, like, especially because the work you all did at the U.S. Social Forum and other places, that this is a group that's just like adopted this pinkwashing stuff, and their real message is this, and then they've like added all this stuff. But A Wider Bridge is like full of people who are just genuinely believe. Like, I think it's a dilemma because people say, oh, when you accuse us of pinkwashing, you're saying that we are lying about what we believe, or that we're just using, which of course the state of Israel is doing in its explicit PR strategy, but there's a lot of people drafted into it who sincerely feel, of course, right, whose feelings have been generated around Israel and their gay identity and all this stuff, and stories about, so I think it's like, this, you know, I had this conversation recently with Chandan Reddy, and he said it becomes just about how to restore a good feeling. Like, that's why these are such good forms of propaganda, is because everyone wants to feel like they went to a really beautiful international event with a gay-friendly country. They were involved in something where everyone was included. Like, these are the stories that we have to fight. And I think this is why it's so interesting. So many of our movements are thinking about things like really articulating that there is these things in terms of war, in terms of counterinsurgency, because we need frames that can capture how violent this is, as opposed to these frames of like good feeling and togetherness that are sincere and still not okay. And that's why to me, like, the campus queer groups or the campus or the, you know, NGLTF are important terrains of struggle, because these are sites where that left values have been eroded so severely that you can be pro-Israel and still be considered progressive, and pro-queer and all these things, and that that's where that meaning is made, where that's the good feeling, that inclusive get together. There's room here for Zionists and anti-Zionists, and no one should be excluded ever. And, you know, like that story, when in reality that will always end in the exclusion of Palestinians, the exclusion of Arab and Muslim people from that space. Yeah.
I'll just jump in briefly here. I think that the whole issue of feelings is super important, because that affect, especially of rescuing people, is so powerful, especially in the immigrant justice movement. You know, we have the anti-trafficking campaigns, which is all about rescuing, you know, for progressives, not from the state, but for progressives and even some leftists who buy into anti-trafficking campaigns. They feel powerful against some really nasty people because they feel like they're helping and rescuing. So it's that politics of humanitarianism and rescue, because, you know, how many times have you seen that phrase, immigrants are welcome here? Yeah, right? I find that incredibly offensive statement, because it's like, who are we to welcome anybody? And what I mean by that is we bought into nationalism so deeply that we actually think that there's some place that some people don't belong, or it's up to us to welcome them here, instead of it is their right to be on the planet, and they can go anywhere they want to go, right, which is the no borders politics. So, like, I think that kind of politics of rescue and humanitarianism is a big barrier to social justice for migrants.
Thanks. So maybe I'll just kind of pick up there, actually, because a question I was sort of thinking about, comment and question, was that part of what I was hearing in the comments today is that on the one hand, the security state requires a victim or a potential victim as part of its rationale for existing. But then what I was also hearing in everybody's comments is the mobilization of the victim in these kind of progressive or so-called progressive movements as well. So, you know, with, and Dylan sort of pushed back on like the critique of mass incarceration, so we get the sort of the victim of over-policing or over-incarceration, which of course leaves behind, you know, those who deserve to be in prison. Or as Rabab was sort of pointing out, that we have on the one hand the need to protect women and children and queers, and women, children, and queers being made particularly vulnerable in the colonial apartheid regime of Israel, right? Or that, you know, we need to protect trans people, and the way that we protect trans people is the incorporation of them into the mechanisms of state violence. And so I guess I'm sort of wondering if what we can think of as, so I'm wondering a little bit if we think this sort of category of victim is one of the things that facilitates the sort of like mainstreaming of left sort of critique and position into these, you know, either watered down versions or, you know, sort of state bolstering versions, and what we think might be like more robust, more complex sort of categories than like the victim in need of protection. Because we wind up calling for protection also, as the security state is also calling for it. So like, any thoughts on that?
And I just really see this limit. I just was in San Diego and I met these trans activists who are trying to organize the first trans pride or some kind of trans celebration thing in San Diego. And there was a fight about whether or not to have the cops included. And San Diego has like a trans cop. And so there's like, that's like a reason they should include the trans cops, you know? And it's just like the kind of like just basic identity, deployment of identity at this point is so painful that they actually are having that fight. Like, it's a big fight because there's a trans cop. Maybe that means the entire police force is fine. I mean, like, I really appreciate the question, yeah.
Well, I think at least in the context of Palestine, transnationally imagined, I think this is a very big dilemma. Because on one hand, on a political level, on a mobilizational level, you want to, at the very least, validate the fact that Palestinians have been victimized. Because sometimes Palestinians are not even allowed to be seen as victims. And then, because there is always I always say I honor indigenous people, and I got an email about 2 weeks ago from a Zionist who says to me, don't you know that Palestinians came in 1966, they were never there, and they're not the indigenous people, and so on. So where do you start? I mean, this is, so there is the whole question, where did Palestinians live? Did John Peters say that Palestinians came after 1948 and populated the lands? They never existed. There is this whole issue of actually just saying that people who've been victimized have been victimized. But once you say that, once you establish that, and you want to mobilize about what do you do with it, I mean, this becomes a big issue. And I do know from my own personal experience that when I have been very much attacked, one of my colleagues said to me that, you know, if you go and speak to the university, the way you speak to it, defiant and strong, nobody's going to listen to you. And one of my colleagues said that actually when they broke out in tears, all of a sudden, people wanted to support them, and this is exactly what happened. We've been victimized for such a long time at San Francisco State University with no program, no support, no structural, institutional support. And the only time things started kicking off when the Horowitz posters appeared. I mean, when it was individualized, it's very unsettling, it's very scary, it raises a lot of security issues. But this was something that came about by a Zionist, nasty right-wing group that seeks to intimidate, criminalize, silence McCarthy's attack. I mean, we all know it. It's an individual thing. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to know how I was feeling. It was the feeling again. And I'm saying, yes, I am not feeling okay about it, but you know, we need to deal with the structural issues. It is the structural, not the individual. We need to deal. And people don't kind of get it. This is one thing. The other thing, I think, in our case is that because of the construction of Islamophobia, because of the construction of anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian hostility, because of our construction as terrorists, always a bomb waiting to blow up. I mean, you really can't get away from it. I may pass, but the minute people hear my name, Abdulhadi, all bets are off. And I become an Abdul, actually. I'm not even Abdulhadi. We're all Abduls. And so, or a man, by the way. They always refer to me as anyway. But the minute you do that, it becomes really difficult to talk about all these other issues because you have all these hurdles. So then, if I am standing for myself, and if Ahed Tamimi, and if we're all standing for ourselves, not as individuals, but are actually representatives of the collective, that the individual is part of the collective, people don't want to hear it. The support stops. It becomes really hard, and when gender is involved in it, when sexuality is involved, because we're supposed to be the ultimate victims. If we do not play the role of the ultimate victims, it doesn't work so well. So then on one hand, you want to be critical, theoretically, of the human rights discourses that universalize and so on. On the other hand, that is the only way people jump in to save you. And if you do not want to be saved, then you are ungrateful. And you are unappreciative of the support, and after all we've done for you, how come you are not being supportive and appreciative? And that becomes really a very, very big dilemma, especially in a movement that everyone wants to do good, and everybody wants to feel great, and there is this whole missionary mentality. We want to go and save the natives. We want to colonize them and tell them what they need to do and give them their food and do everything, and then we want to save them. And it becomes, it's a very, very huge political dilemma that we end up policing each other and saying, you cannot say this. This is how you need to say it. We spend most of our time framing how we are going to present and which word do you use, and do we use Zionism and colonialism? Do you say settler colonialism or we don't say settler colonialism? And I'm telling you, I have war stories. So the question is, Dylan, is if we want to tell the stories, if people know, what does it do when people know what they know? I mean, in 1982, Israel, there was a poster from the Israeli peace movement that said, if people know, if people knew. And it has a soldier stepping on the neck of a Palestinian child. People know. Yeah. People know. So what happens, and we continue to need to package things in a way, and I'm really at a loss. I do not know. I really don't know, and this is a space for us to have these discussions. What do we do about them, and how do we shake people? Because people will agree, and then we're going to go out and write the grants, and apply for sabbaticals, and apply for leaves, and submit proposals to conferences, and so on. And we need to play the same dance again and again and again, because for the time being, it's not working otherwise. And one more thing is that we're in the US. So in the US, it makes a very different sense than if we are in other places. I think sensibilities and the way people think about things act differently in different places and in different mediums too, so no solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think victimhood is really central to the anti-trafficking framework. I can't tell you how many panels I've seen where you have a lineup of women, usually billed as former sex workers, who talk about having been trafficked in the service of justifying anti-trafficking measures. And like Dean was saying about various other measures, anti-trafficking is growing too, right? Like it's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry rescuing people who have been trafficked, both NGOs here in the United States especially, but internationally, it's a big, big business. And what do you say to a woman, and it's, again, always a woman, and I think there's, we can analyze that. I mean, I'm sure many of you understand that already. What do you say to a woman who is telling you that she's a victim, and therefore you must support anti-trafficking measures, right? Like that is just, that is kind of like meant to be a barrier to ending critique, to making whatever she is advocating unpolitical, right? So there's a kind of violence that victimhood does. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to repoliticize these measures, right? We need to say, actually, they're under contestation. Anti-trafficking is not a done deal. This is under contestation. There's some of us who are in the migrant justice movement that have serious problems with this framework. And these are the reasons why. And ultimately, I agree with Rabab, like these are structural issues. And part of the structure is, the nation state. The nation state, the nation form of state power is especially and perhaps uniquely concerned with stopping the movement of people into state territory, right? And starting in the late 19th century and continuing and intensifying during World War I, during the interwar period, during World War II, and after World War II, it's a done deal, right? After World War II, the amount of border controls that are up, the passport controls, the visa controls, the short stop operations, the interdictions, it is a done deal. We are in a global lockdown. It is impossible to move without state permission or without the help of someone who is going to be criminalized as a smuggler or a trafficker. And that's what we need to deal with, right?
Dylan, did you have anything you wanted to
Yeah, sorry, I'm just, y'all too smart. Sorry, I'm taking notes. Can I just thank you for the question, first of all, because it's got my wheels turning. So yeah, I mean, let me say yeah first, that the stories we tell always fall back on some version of vindicated victimhood, right? That we're turning this thing on its head. We're speaking from the other side of a proverbial coin, and it just reminds me how difficult it is, but also how important and ultimately accessible it is to consider ways of honoring the vulnerability of people's ways of being human, that doesn't just honor oppressed people's suffering, but also honors their collective and creative genius, their capacity to generate creativity, or I'm talking ordinary flawed people who've done dirt, people who are guilty. All right, let me just say, people who are guilty, not people who are claiming innocence, people who will tell you about their guilt, right? But who nonetheless, like in a relentless way, generate art, creativity, music, beauty. That's the story that we have trouble speaking to and telling, because we always want to fucking fall back on innocence, victimhood, vindicated, et cetera. I keep coming back to both the kind of flourishing in Renaissance and then the kind of ongoing praxis of incarcerated people who are striking, right? Hunger striking, labor striking, and other forms of striking, who are not relying on claims of innocence, right? What they're claiming is a vulnerable, guilty humanity. That's and people will use in I think rigorous ways, not in appropriate ways, but will use the kind of relation of slavery a lot. Like the Georgia prison strike, the relation of slavery was drawn upon all the time, but it wasn't about a narrative of victimhood. It wasn't about just inhabiting suffering. It was about slave rebellion, right? That's what I got from that. But those of us who are in this kind of engaged in a war position in civil society in these different ways, I think we have trouble holding on to that because the assholes on the right will just point to, well, that guy killed somebody. You know what I mean? That person did this and that person did that, and then we get silent. So I feel like some of the stories that we're struggling for are actually being told. It's just a question of maybe honoring them in a different way, right? In a more amplified and different way. Maybe speaking to them and writing about them more. Maybe, I don't know. I'm at a loss, but I'm not at a loss. You know what I mean?
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so let's open up to some questions.
Hi, thank you very much for a really inspiring panel. My question is about legitimizing the system that you seek to abolish. And there are a few things, particularly between what Dean was saying, what Rabab was saying, that I found very interesting. About, Dean, you mentioned the bill that your colleagues were, or you were critical of, but your friends were kind of engaging with. And it made me think about a talk I went to where an Israeli lawyer was defending Palestinians living under military law, and they were talking about how the difficulty he had with justifying or legitimizing the very system he wants to abolish, but if he didn't do it, then the kid would get 20 years instead of 10, for instance. So within desiring abolition as an overall goal, how do you then, what's the praxis that goes into everyday encounters of trying to decolonize, but also engage with a system that has dealt your oppression and try and make better the situation you're in until such a time as we reach abolition? Thank you.
Given the gravity of the situation, the surveillance state, the fact that propaganda is legal in the US, the fact that the National Defense Act says that you can pretty much declare anyone an enemy of the state under vague terms and detain them without access to a lawyer is a whole other thing. Given all of this, what are some tangible ways in which we can combat it? The workshops were great. That doesn't necessarily mean putting people back into the system and co-opting that energy, such as saying, oh, hey, run for a position in office, or, oh, hey, vote a politician in, because if we've seen the election fraud with what happened during, let's say, the Clinton campaign and the primaries, right, that those, and how New York State got in trouble for purging people off the voter rolls, if those two things aren't really a tangible ways, I want to hear some more tangible ways that we can combat this.
Dean, when you were talking about the bill in Washington, of course, and these mental health trainings, the first thing that came to my mind was, the shootings. And so the framing of mass violence, which is really terrorist violence in terms of mental health, as a way of just completely, whitewashing the arms industry. So abolitionism has to include abolishing those weapons, right? So could you just address that, maybe the broader use of this mental health, discourse as a way to hide state violence?
Should we work with those 3 questions and then go from there? Yeah. I'll let you all sort of start where you want, and then please sort of restate, or in your version, the question that you're responding to.
Okay. The question that was just asked was about kind of this moment of mass shootings and the way that the gun control debate is all about, like, preventing people who have mental health diagnoses from accessing guns, and how inadequate that is because it doesn't really deal with the arms industry as the actual generator of high levels of guns in the US. And I think I've also heard other people like Raina Gossett, a thinker I really admire. She has talked about how the exact things that gun control would put into place are things that would keep guns out of the hands of the same populations that are already less likely to be able to defend themselves, because people are clearly more likely to be diagnosed with mental illness or have criminal background check, not pass a criminal background check. And so it all just concentrates guns in the hands of white men who, as we know, are extremely violent. And she also talks about how the most registered guns are also the most deadly guns. Like police guns are the ones that we should really worry about, which also ties into something that Ruthie and Craig Gilmore say in their essay, which is that we get so distracted by being worried about only the most militarized aspects of police technology that we forget that it's the handgun itself that is the most dangerous thing the police have. I think that's such a powerful point. So I love all of those reframings. These are vital abolitionist questions about how we come to see, also just political questions about how we come to see in the US like a conversation that is all so far to the right that it can only imagine these problems as a question of like who gets to buy a gun, as opposed to the zillions of other underlying questions about self-defense, about the histories of disarming people of color in the US and indigenous people. So many pieces to that. One project that I think, there was another question about kind of how do we do this abolitionist work in the day-to-day, and there was a question about whether we do strategies that are inside or outside strategies, like electoral strategies or things like that. One project that I'm really inspired by that I know also collaborates a lot with the Barnard Center for Research on Women is the Survived and Punished project, which is a project focused on defense campaigns for people who are locked up because they defended themselves, often in terms of sexual violence or intimate partner violence. And that kind of work, the immediate defense work of people who are the targets of these systems, brings up a lot of those same questions that I think come up in the failures of the gun control debate to really be useful. Just to answer that question about abolition, I think that what we get from the kind of leading abolitionist organizations like Critical Resistance and others is that the daily work of abolition is the work to dismantle the existing apparatuses, so fighting whenever they're trying to build new jails, or the fight to stop new police academies from being built, or to expand police training. The work to support people currently imprisoned and currently under police and immigration control, so like the day-to-day one-on-one work. And this has been like my obsession in the last couple of years, is really trying to raise conversations about mutual aid, and how because this really relates to what you're saying for me, Dylan, about one of the dilemmas right now also about false victory stories is feel-good stories about how like someone went online and held up a sign that said they cared about somebody else. Like that's the stuff we're supposed to see as a victory. There's like a really deep symbolic realm right now that's very much generated by social media and about personal empowerment in this very like limited way. And so for me, mutual aid projects are a real alternative to that. Like if we were all involved in mutual aid projects ranging from like prison letter writing to jail support to child care to helping people get rides to faraway prisons for their families to, if we were all involved in mutual aid projects about things that we feel, just one, about that, something we feel really passionate about, we'd be very differently networked as a set of movements. And when I look historically at moments where movements have been able to hold up undesirable victims, right? Like when movements have been able to say, like, yes, this person who's been labeled as a violent predator actually is, we all are behind them, right? When movements have been able to shed the kind of deserving, undeserving, it's because people in those movements had enough contact with those systems to not believe the labels of those systems, right? And to believe that we are fighting for everybody, not one more deportation, right? Like abolition for all as opposed to for the people with nonviolent charges or not sex offenders, you know? So I think that to me there's a really deep piece around, also it's easier for us to not buy into like the stories about how gun control will help us with mental health when we actually have community-based plans to provide mutual aid for each other that is not through the police when we are literally having a lot of mental health crises, which of course we would have in this society that is this level of violence and deprivation and harm. So I think that for me, like the thing that ties a lot of the questions together is that is looking at mutual aid strategies and seeing how contemporary politics aims to demobilize us from doing work that's about material conditions and to mobilize us only to do work that's about declaring our opinions and symbolic realms, and then also having those opinions mirrored back to us by public officials or by corporations, so then we feel like at ease because we were recognized, and that is not winning.
Yeah. Running out of paper. The question of legitimating systems that we wish to abolish. I mean, I'll say something I've learned in different places and in different crowds of people over the years is that for a lot of folks, the systems are already deeply illegitimate. I mean, it's part of the reason why I've been privileged to work at UC Riverside for all these years. I mean, UC Riverside students that I talk to, there's 3 right here, y'all right here. I walk in a room and we already share, we already share a commitment to trying to understand and further deeply analyze the system's illegitimacy. You follow what I'm saying? Which means that the nature of the work that we're going to do together kind of changes, right? Now we kind of understand the system. The reach of the system is so fucking comprehensive, right? It's pretty hard to be outside of it. You know what I'm saying? Like I know full well every single day I am not outside of it, right? There's certain parts of it I can celebrate being apart from and against, but I'm in a pretty comprehensive fucking system. So the question is whether I'm for it. Right? And if I'm not, then how can I manifest that pedagogically, creatively, collectively, and to also understand that, you know, the notion of being in these positions as requiring a kind of transposition of the ideas of guerrilla warfare is real, right? There's a kind of notion of guerrilla war that I think people need to bring into their places of work. Maybe I've said too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a question that's arising for me from your questions as well as from the comments of the other panelists is, what is the system? Like, some of us have different ideas of how far a systemic analysis goes and which part is legitimate and which is illegitimate, right? So, you know, I am a no borders activist. I do not want the state to have control over the freedom of human mobility, period, right? And states exist to control people's mobility. Nation states have a particular version of that, which is controlling people's entry into state territory, but all states have an interest in controlling people's mobility. So how far are we willing to go in our analysis of the system, and what are we willing to do about that? But at the same time, I have to say that if, you know, I've worked with a lot of people who need refugee status or who need to be recognized as having a right to be somewhere, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm never going to tell someone who is undocumented that that I'm not going to help them get the status that they need. But while I'm helping them, I would say, yeah, and this is very, you know, and I agree with Dylan on this, right, that people know it's an illegitimate system, right? They know that they would, if you ask, people want no borders versus refugee status, but they also know that they're not going to get no borders tomorrow. right? But it's something that we need to work for. So I think there is this kind of double game that we need to play in our revolutions, which is not to dismiss reform either, right? In the immediate sense, because many migrants, you know, many of the movements in 2006 before they were squashed, were calling for citizenship, right? Citizenship is actually part of the problem, you know, and how many of us are willing to recognize that? How many of us are willing to recognize citizenship is part of the problem? How many of us think that national liberation is going to free us, right? How many of us think that being sovereign is the goal, right? That that's what we call liberation, right? How far are we willing to go in recognizing what is illegitimate and what is part of the system? And I think that for many of us, we can push ourselves much further.
So, I've been thinking about what you're all saying, and I think want to go back to what you were saying, Dylan, about the people who are guilty, okay, or the people who have done what they have been accused of, right? And you mentioned hunger strikers, and I was thinking about Palestinian prisoners, and I was thinking about the ways in which people engage in certain things and the danger involved in even speaking about that. Okay, that's one of the issues I will mention. The other thing is the question of what, and I'm so talking to everybody, what and to whom and where, and which audiences. So you spoke about national liberation, and before you even spoke about that, I was thinking about, well, okay, no borders. What happens when a community does not even have any kind of like, any control over anything? I'm not talking only about the Palestinians, I'm talking about indigenous people here. When we talk about citizenship, US citizenship, what does that mean? What does that mean for indigenous people? Whose citizenship, who's awarding it, for whom, and what does it entail? So I keep going between the two things, and then I was thinking that when we engage in all this critique, then people who want to go and organize movements and want to say Free Ahad Tamimi or want to talk about support for Standing Rock or for the refugees and so on, are people going to feel demobilized? And I know that people in the movement are going to say, how am I going to do it? Because I'm going to feel now completely useless. I'm not going to be able to do anything because it is not the politically correct in the correct way of the politically correct, not in the right-wing way, and so on. So how do we think about all of these things? So there is multiple levels of analysis, I think. I think there is multiple levels of action. I really love, even though I have a problem with Anne Swidlow and her Zionism and her stance in Berkeley and so on, but I love a long time article she wrote about the toolkit of organizing. And people who organize are not necessarily very puritanical that they have to abide to Trotskyism or Stalinism or Maoism or liberalism. Or you organize your community how you want to organize. This is one thing. And then people organize and debate around this. So this is like multiple levels in the intellectual space and in the academic space. So I'm trying to think about all of these things because I would not want, and I don't think any of us, it's the same way you're saying about if somebody wants to get refugees, how are you going to stop them? People need to have safety. People need to have security. So there is the reform and there is the, let's say, the tactical aspect of it today, and there is the long-term thing. And I think I think one of the things we need more spaces to be able to have these discussions. And I think there is always danger involved in what we discuss and how we discuss and to whom we say and where we say and who says what. So I think there is multiple ways that is kind of like, I would like us to have maybe another week to think about, really, I mean, I'm just always talking about this, but I think and then the whole question of who's we. When we say we, who are we talking? Who's part of the we-ness? Which we-ness? And in what time and what place and what does this mean? But really, my most urgent thing is how do we organize? How do we organize to change the world? How do you organize for justice? And which justices get suspended at a certain time when we are pushing for other justices? And how does the whole question of what is worthy and what's not worthy?
I was wondering in terms of just Trump, do you feel like he actually cares, or he listening, or in terms of media? Just a little brief opinion from anybody. Thank you.
My question is kind of a little bit about what you all were just talking about in the last discussion. Is there any models anywhere in even other parts of the world that you would go to in terms of what a state could look like, or what you would want a state to look like, or if the role is just not to have a state? And if when you're having like the state kind of keep usurping its power and kind of like spreading out like a parasite into different organizing spaces or organizing ideas, either how would you put a stop to it, or how would you change the paradigm and change the way that that would look like so it doesn't do that? Or how, in the way that it is taking those ideas, make it less problematic? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So let's take these two questions about Trump and about the state. Yeah. We want to give one answer to both.
So, yeah, Trump is a good enough reason to not have states, right? And state power. I mean, I can't ever imagine fighting for justice and fighting for a state, any kind of state. And I'm really, you know, I'm a child of a Maoist that is an anarchist, right? So probably not unrelated trajectory there. But you know, I think the work that I always look to answer those kinds of questions is the work of Sylvia Wynter. And I really appreciate her work that tells us that, you know, this world that we're living in now has never existed before, right? This is a new world. It's not the kind of new world that Christopher Columbus had in mind, right? But in that incredible, you know, centuries of violence that we have lived through, and I include the violence of identification here, how we have been identified, subjectivized to belong to races and nations and genders. I reject all of that. But I'm with Sylvia Wynter in saying that we've also, through all that violence, made connections and made a new world. And it's up to us to fight fights that have never been fought before, to be people we have never been before. And one of the things that I draw upon is the identification of being a commoner, right? That's really the only kind of political project that I can get down with, is to reclaim our commons. And that commons isn't going to look like the commons before colonialism, before imperialism. It's going to look like a different commons. And from the perspective of a, you know, no borders movement, that commons is going to have to be global, right? Because how are we going to have a commons in one place and we don't let other people into it? Like, that doesn't make any sense, and that's not the world that we live in. So that's what I fight for, and also against Donald Trump.
I think I just want to add a couple of things. I think I am not as sold against the state, even though I say whether Palestinians say to them, people say, you don't want a state? Why you don't want a state? You want one state, you want two states? But I have been for a long time thinking about the social welfare state. That until we get to the point where we are eliminating the states altogether, there are responsibilities. And how do we deal with the responsibilities? Who's providing shelter? Who's providing? So it's not, I mean, maybe I can't envision it because I'm not really a sold out anarchist. And I'm thinking ideologically. I mean, I'm happy to be convinced, but this is where I'm at now. And I'm thinking, in the meantime, what do we do? What do we do? Who's providing these things? And how are we going to allow everybody to control our fate and not to actually fight for things that will change things, reform again? So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking also about the multiple generations, and I think we talk about security, multiple generations of people who rise up and they get assassinated day in and day out, whether it is outright assassination or it is slow death. that is going on that basically deplete us of the possibilities to come and think together. Collectively, how do we do that? The last thing about Trump, and really nasty, fascist, horrible thing, and so on. A lot of the stuff, however, that are in place, they happened during Obama. And I think people really need, and I also don't, I'm not inviting white supremacy and racism here, because I think also the fact that Obama was elected into office is a testament to which generation elected him and how the times have changed from segregation and so on. So I think it's really, like, contextually, we really need to think about what does that mean too. He's part of the system, and the system reproduces itself until we stop it. So from now, what do people want to do? What are people, everybody got upset when Trump was elected and so on, and people did resistance and this and that, and now people seem to be jaded. Everything he does is normalized. People laugh about the tweets, people laugh about what's going on. What are people going to do to change the world? We think, we talk, we analyze. What were we going to do? I mean, at the end of the day, what are we going to do about it? Are people going to get out of their comfort zone and change things? Or are we going to only be in a defensive mode? And I'm talking about legal defensive, by the way. I am not talking about violence or anything like that, just in case whoever is listening and wants to take me to jail. Okay. I'm not, rather than defensive, what are we going to do to build communities in order for us to take charge of our lives? And I think this is really the question that we need to be thinking about. People need to get out of their comfort zone, and we need to do something about it. Otherwise, what we're seeing today is going to get worse tomorrow. And it's getting worse if we don't do anything about it. So.
I'll say something real quick, just because I think class of '97, Dean Spade should have the last word.
Okay.
Just really quick, every day, this is kind of a response to both of you in a way, more to the second question than the first probably. Every day I realize that I'm not actually sure I'm prepared to live in a liberated sociality, whether it's with a state or stateless, right? I think I'm probably too fucked up to do that, okay? Like, you'd have to find a really compartmentalized role for me to play in a liberated society that would take advantage of my good parts and, like, isolate all the reactionary parts of me. You know what I mean? It's like, so it's a kind of humility that I've started growing old with, that I'm kind of just owning. At the same time, that I'll kind of reveal that of myself, I'll also say that I also believe that the very, very bare minimum that I can do, as I exist on the mortal coil, is to make a contribution to a liberated sociality, right? To try to mitigate all the reactionary, horrible parts of me, the flawed and guilty parts of me, and to be able to funnel and create something with the parts of me that I think can join with you all in beauty and in liberation and that kind of desire. So that's what I want. That's what I want. Might be with the state, might be without the state. And fuck Donald Trump, but also fuck Obama. Whoops.
This question with the state is such an interesting one. I think what I've been trying to think about for years is, like, what's the difference? What is the state, and what is, like, stateness, or the qualities or tendencies toward that we would need to watch everywhere, not only in the government but also in ourselves and in other groupings. And some of the things I noticed that I think state means are, like, having borders, having borders, having prisons, having extensive surveillance technology, and redistributing. I mean, it's upward. But that project of redistribution, I think, might have something to do with stateness, and I am interested in redistribution. So that's, like, these are really complicated, tangly problems for those of us who desperately want redistribution, but see the state's function has been a certain kind of redistribution towards whiteness and upward for a long time, and towards concentrating wealth. So for me, I don't want the thing that we would call the state now, because I don't want any prisons or borders, clearly, and surveillance. And I'm interested in all the projects where we look to figure out how we can meet each other's and our needs as collectivities with a constant eye towards the dangers of stateness that creep up into us. Like, when in our groups do we try to engage in enemy creation? When do we produce hierarchies of deservingness? Those things are dangers inside every redistributive project, which is what all of our mutual aid projects, which is what I think we should be doing, in case I didn't mention that enough, should be doing. And the thing that I hear in all these answers too is that, like, for me, the place I look for the practices of self-critique and mutual feedback that we need is women of color feminisms. Like that's the most, to me, one of the most richest areas of theorization of and practice of how we try to produce collective responses and ways of meeting each other's needs and being together in new ways while knowing that we're always, of course, doing it wrong and dealing with all the baggage that Dylan was just describing. We are not the people we need to be to live in the new society because we were raised in the prison society and the white supremacy society. And also, I'm particularly interested in all of the transformative justice work happening around the country where people are having these really complex conversations about accountability and how we have this desire to make accountability about like finding the person who did something wrong, as opposed to accountability is like most intensively about ourselves and about the ways in which we have to be checked out from our own pain and other people's pain in order to survive in this society, and how that creates a culture of disposability and a desire to not be nobody and to be somebody, as Raina Gossett says. So those questions about our personal capacities to do that critical work, give and receive feedback, they're intimately tied to me to living past, to getting away from the context of the fear-based nation state that's all about the victim role and all about security. So I'm really glad that we ended with that very hard question.
Okay, well, since I have your attention and a microphone, I just want to echo Dean's encouragement from earlier to please go to cancelpinkwashing.org. Although the task force has said it does no policy work on Israel, it's partnered with an Israeli-based circuit party for a big fundraiser in March, so we're trying to get them to cancel that, so it's still really important. Put your name on the letter. So thank you for taking that plug. And I loved this conversation. It was so incredible. I'm so grateful to everybody on the panel and everybody in the audience. I know that this conversation, we wish it could go on all week. But again, I just want to say I'm so grateful. I know there's years and years of working, thinking, teaching, and like being in the struggle that have allowed us then to have a conversation at this level. So thank you all for bringing all of that, and thank all of you, and BCRW for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, Craig.
And we'll
Thank
see
you,
you
Craig.
here tomorrow.